All right, well, welcome to session 4 of our Foundations for Parenting class. This morning, we're going to be looking at what it means to be a proactive parent as opposed to a reactive parent. So often, it can feel like as parents that we're just responding to whatever our children do. And that is definitely a part of being a parent. Certainly we can't anticipate everything. But the Bible is very clear that we are supposed to, as parents, be focused. We're supposed to be intentional. We're supposed to have a plan and a purpose behind what we do as parents. And so I'm going to start right off with maybe the most familiar verse about parenting in the whole Bible, and that's Proverbs 22, verse 6. Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. There's so many people who have had different understandings about what this means, and I think a lot of them miss sort of the very clear and simple description of parenting that Solomon lays out for us. And that simply is that there is a progression from young to old. And so what I want to begin with, sort of the first lesson of being a proactive parent, is that it simply means, first of all, to begin early. It's never too early to start to train your children in the ways of the Lord. And that's exactly what Solomon says here in Proverbs 22:6. When are we to train them? When they are young. In other words, he's saying, initiate the discipline and instruction. Remember from previous sessions, that's one of the primary responsibilities of a parent toward a child, to discipline and instruct. Begin that when they are young, when they are children. Train up a child in the way he should go. So there's a clear direction this is to take from young to old. Start when they are young. Instruct them in truths relating to life and godliness in ways that are accessible to their age, but don't think that just because my child is very young that I don't need to begin right now. Obviously, this would also imply things like repetition then. When you begin young, you have opportunity to teach them and introduce concepts to them again and again and again. Also, revisiting truths at different age levels, at different levels of maturity, at different depths then. When they're young, you begin with very simple concepts and simple truths. As they grow older, you begin to develop that instruction into more nuanced and more specific application. The depth grows deeper and deeper. So a great illustration of this in a very relatable situation is simply the frustration that many parents have when it comes to taking their kid to the dentist's office or the doctor's office, or they're going to go to a restaurant or even sit in church, and they're all squirming and all over the place. And the idea is that that's not the time to start to instruct them in how to sit still and how to be, not just all over the place. You start at home and you start small and you start with lots of support. You give them rewards for doing what you're expecting them to do, and rewards doesn't have to be screens, and probably shouldn't be screens if you can help it. And you gradually work to longer and longer times with less and less supporting results. And you're going to do that hopefully you don't have to do that with a 15-year-old, right? But when your children are very young, that's a very simple thing. They don't instinctively know how to do that. And so you have to instruct them when they are young. It's a simple illustration, but hopefully you get the point. When Solomon gets to the idea of being old, He's not saying that they are elderly and it's only towards the end of their life that they return to their parents' instructions. But rather, the idea is that as they grow older, as they progress through life, the things that their parents instructed them beginning at a young age will remain with them. The aim is long term. And so that's where he says, will not depart. They will remember these things. Now remember, this is a proverb, so this isn't a promise that if you do this, there's a guaranteed slam dunk that this is going to happen to your children and the lives of your children as they get older. But this is a proverb that is saying that this is a pattern that we can see and follow, and it bears itself out again and again and again. It's universally recognized that young children are more impressionable, more malleable, if you will, than adults. Certainly more than teenagers. Teenagers maybe are even more set in their ways than older adults. Doesn't mean that we adults are hopeless cases, but it's just a lot easier to instruct children, and the effects are much longer lasting. So, being proactive means starting early. Being proactive also means protecting your children from inappropriate influences, staying ahead of cultural bombardment. Doesn't mean you have to raise your children in a bubble, that they can't see or be exposed to anything but the most sterile and controlled environments. But it is better and easier to guard them from wickedness and error than it is to work to correct the undue influences of the world that they absorb from the culture. And this is maybe one of the most daunting tasks that we parents face, because cultural bombardment is all around us. It is just infused in every aspect of our lives. So it can be very challenging to protect our children from this, but it is something that we as parents must proactively strive towards. Psalm 1 says, "Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked, nor stands in the way of sinners, nor sits in the seat of scoffers." I mean, and this is something that we want to take seriously even for our youngest children. We want to guard them against that. I read an article not that long ago from the BBC about children being exposed to pornography online. And the average age of that happening has dropped over and over and over again to now that it's down to like 8 and 9 years old when the average child is first exposed to pornography online. And I mention that just to point out that illustrates just how pervasive it is. That without intentionally exposing your children to it, just by allowing them free access online, they somehow navigate their way to it without even trying to find it. It has a way of finding them. So, being a reactive parent, you simply that just assumes the best, presumes the best will happen, nothing bad will happen. You are often going to deal with the fallout of that naivete, because this, without being proactive about guarding your children, the wickedness of the world has a way of finding them. Number 3, what it means to be a proactive parent, not a reactive parent, is it means not waiting till there's a problem or pretending that small problems don't need your attention. Many parents act with the assumption that their kids aren't perfect, but they are fine and they're going to be fine. Maybe they're not perfect, but everything is just going to work out. How many times have you seen the parents of a teenager on the news and the teenager has been convicted of a heinous crime, and the parents say something like, "This isn't like him. He's a good kid." Permissiveness leads to reactive parenting. Permissiveness is not proactive. Permissiveness allows bad and sinful behaviors in a child so long as it's not too bad. Now, don't hear me saying that you have to bring the heavy hammer of discipline down on your child every time even the most minor infractions occur. No, I mean, discipline, remember, we talked about this before, discipline is not a synonym for punishment. Those two can be associated, but discipline is supposed to be proportionate to what it is you're trying to instill in your children. So I'm not suggesting that you have to treat your child as if they are a prisoner and you are the prison guard. But you have to be very careful because there is this, I don't like the term slippery slope, but there is an easy progression that you can see happening in children's lives again and again. And it might go something like this, where it starts by allowing bad behavior as long as it's not too bad. So we'll permit disobedience as long as they don't throw a temper tantrum. And then we'll permit a temper tantrum as long as they don't hit. And then we'll permit hitting as long as they say they're sorry. And you can see where it goes from there. The priest Eli in the Old Testament is a classic example of a reactive parent rather than a proactive parent. And his reactive style was to be very permissive, to look the other way and hope that things would just change. Let me turn to 1 Samuel chapter 2 and read a few verses there about Eli's permissive and reactive parenting style. In verse 12 of chapter 2, we read this. Now the sons of Eli were worthless men. They did not know the Lord. The custom of the priest with the people was that when any man offered sacrifice, the priest's servant would come. And while the meat was boiling, with a 3-pronged fork in his hand, he would thrust it in to the pan or kettle or cauldron or pot. And all that the fork brought up, the priest would take for himself. This is what they did at Shiloh to all the Israelites who came there. Moreover, the fat was burned. The priest's servants would come and say to the men who were sacrificing, "Give meat for the priest to roast, for he will not accept boiled meat from you, but only raw." And if the man said to him, let them burn the fat first, and then take as much as you wish, he would say, "No, you must give it now, and if not, I will take it by force." Thus the sin of the young men was very great in the sight of the Lord, for the men treated the offering of the Lord with contempt. So real quickly, what's going on here is the priest would be provided for through these sacrificial offerings. They would eat this meat, but it had to be cooked first, and then they would stick this fork in and pull out what they could. But Eli's sons wanted to stick the fork in before the meat was cooked. So you understand, you stick a fork into cooked meat that's tender, you're going to pull up a lot less than if you just stick it into a raw hunk of meat. So it was their way of sort of skimming from this offering and getting more than they were entitled to. And then in verse 22 and 25, we read this. Now Eli was very old, and he kept hearing all that his sons were doing to all Israel, and how they lay with the women who were serving at the entrance of the tent of meeting. And he said to them, "Why do you do such things? For I hear of your evil dealings from all these people. No, my sons, it is no good report that I hear of the people spreading abroad. If someone sins against a man, God will mediate for him. But if someone sins against the Lord, who can intercede for them?" But they would not listen to the voice of their father, for it was the will of the Lord to put them to death. So Eli knew all about this. I mean, they're now adults, but who knows when all this stuff began. By the time Eli is in his old age, they're having sex with the women who are working in the tent of meeting. It is both a condemnation on them as it is on his reactive, permissive parenting. And the end results were devastating, not only for Eli and his sons, but really for the people of Israel as well, whom they were supposed to be serving as priests. Number 4, what it means to be a proactive parent is that it means celebrating their good behavior, but not assuming they will just figure life out in their own way and in their own time. Proverbs 22:15 says, "Folly is bound up in the heart of a child, but the rod of discipline drives it far from him." In other words, don't wait till your children are out of control and only then seek to discipline and instruct them. Celebrate their successes. Encourage their godly behavior. When they show signs of maturity and growth, point that out to them and let them know that you are so encouraged by that, and that brings you so much joy to see that in their lives. Point out the ways that they're living that the Bible says is pleasing to the Lord. But don't ever assume, while they are under your authority as parents, that you can ever just take your hands off the parenting wheel and put it on cruise control. If anything, lean into those signs of success and work to build on them. Proverbs 20, verse 4 said, "The sluggard does not plow in the autumn. He will seek at the harvest and have nothing." The reactive parent is a lot like that farmer who cannot be bothered to plow when it's time to plow. And so when it's time to harvest, they end up with nothing. Nothing in this case would be rebellious, maladjusted adults who don't know how to function in the world, who don't know how to honor God with their lives. Doesn't mean that God can't redeem people in their brokenness as adults. That happens all the time. Praise the Lord. But we're talking about the responsibilities of parents. You're not responsible for the outcome, but you are responsible to be obedient to what God calls you to do as parents. And that means being proactive in the way you parent your children. And one of those ways is when you see good behavior, celebrate it, lean into it, encourage your children about that. Let them know how much that fills you with joy. But don't let that good behavior be an excuse for you to just take your hands off the parenting and assume that everything is still going to work out. It also means, as being proactive, it means acknowledging the laws of sowing and reaping. This is all throughout Scripture, this concept of reaping what you have sown. When you are not being proactive as a parent, when you're simply being reactive, that is its own kind of sowing. It's a kind of instruction. The plan of sowing, as we've talked about in previous sessions, should be progressive. Toddlers and teenagers are not the same. So start sowing into your children right now. Don't wait till they are at whatever future age you think would be appropriate. Remember, train up a child in the way they should go. God is not mocked. Whatever a man sows, that will he reap. And that includes you as parents. In Proverbs, the words discipline and instruction are often used interchangeably. And what that means is that the parent's duty is to instruct and discipline, and it is the wise child who responds favorably to a parent's instruction. It's the fool who hates instruction and discipline. In other words, there's a kind of sowing and reaping even in your children as well. They sow and reap through listening and obeying. We as parents sow and reap by instruction and discipline. We have to acknowledge that that is the way God has designed the parent-child relationship to work, and we have to take seriously our responsibilities to sow into the hearts and lives of our children. Here's another one, and this can be so hard as parents. I will acknowledge that figuring out and navigating this can be difficult, but it is so vital, and that means being proactive means letting your yes be yes and your no be no. I want to read James chapter 5, verse 12. I'll flip over there real quick. James 5:12. But above all, my brothers, do not swear either by heaven or earth or by an oath, but let your yes be yes and your no be no, so that you may not fall under condemnation. James 5:12, it's about telling the truth. You shouldn't need to swear on a stack of Bibles or your mother's grave or whatever it is in order to convince somebody that you are telling the truth. Your words, yes or no, should be all that is required. And one of the things that we are instructed as parents, specifically fathers, is not to provoke our children to anger. And one of the most common ways that we as parents anger and are often reactive in our parenting is by being inconsistent. We say yes to something one day and no to the next. We administer some sort of corrective discipline towards something one day and completely ignore it the next. And we are confusing and frustrating and provoking our children to anger because they don't know what is expected. They don't know what the standard is. Because one day it's yes and the next day it's no. Without any instruction or without any explanation. Teaching your children no, but then letting them continue on in disobedience leads to reactive parenting like threats and angry outbursts and even physical violence against children. Because we, by saying one thing but allowing something else until we reach our breaking point and then we respond sinfully towards them, could have all been avoided if we had simply been consistent with our parenting from the start. It doesn't mean that because you have said no to something this one day that it has to be no for all time and eternity. Sometimes that no is related to age. It's no now because it's not appropriate or the child doesn't have the ability to do that. We don't let 5-year-olds drive cars, okay? That doesn't mean they won't ever be able to. Doesn't mean it's always going to be no, but sometimes it's not appropriate for certain things because of their age or their level of maturity. But as they grow and mature, that no can turn into a yes. But what we're saying here is we want to be consistent. And when we do change, there needs to be instruction and explanation as to why. It can't just be sort of random and willy-nilly at the whims of your particular feelings that day that is never communicated to the child. That just leads to frustration and anger. Another way to be proactive as a parent, not just reactive, is recognizing we have to give greater responsibility before there's greater freedom. As your children grow and mature, your goal should be that they reach a point where they are functioning as mature, independent, responsible adults. That's the goal. The goal isn't to be huddling over them for the rest of their lives, sheltering, protecting, directing. Your life is supposed to be instructing them, helping them to grow and mature. physically, emotionally, spiritually, all of that. Success in those areas is more than just simple independence. The economics of our day can mean that independence is very different than when we were young adults. But what it means is taking responsibility for succeeding in life. You guys remember that when that expression adulting was so popular on social media? And it was typically the most basic of adult actions. I went out by myself and bought my own coffee. I'm adulting. I'm buying a gallon of milk. I'm going to the DMV. I'm adulting. I'm paying my taxes. I'm making coffee this morning. I'm adulting. Success means more than pretending to be an adult occasionally on TikTok or Instagram. It means living responsibly in society, out from under the umbrella of the protection that we parents have provided for our children as they've grown up. And it's not going to happen automatically. And many parents discover this too late. Either they are forced to cope with a child who is unprepared to deal with the challenges of adulthood. Everything from poor work ethic, they're just lazy, to spiritual apathy. Once they're no longer forced to participate in church. Other times, parents are forced to address a child who is now independent and is an absolute mess because they haven't been trained and led to that point. In 1 Corinthians chapter 13:11, Paul says, "When I was a child, I spoke like a child, thought like a child, reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I gave up childish ways." And we as parents, it's our responsibility to parent our children in a way that helps them move from that childish thinking, childish speaking, gradually as they grow, to be able to put away those childish ways and live as mature, godly adults. In 1 Kings chapter 2, David is about to die, and he's giving some last words of advice to Solomon. And he says this, "I am about to go the way of all the earth. Be strong and show yourself a man, and keep the charge of the Lord your God, walking in his ways, keeping his statutes, his commandments, his rules, his testimonies, as it is written in the law of Moses, that you may prosper in all that you do wherever you turn." David's sort of final words to Solomon are simply like, be a man, be a mature adult, and how you do that is by living according to the Word of God in the way that you have learned it. Titus chapter 2 lets us know, gives us assurance that we as parents don't have to be and probably shouldn't be the only people who are teaching and leading and leaning into the lives of our children. And in fact, in Titus chapter 2, verses 1 through 8, it's a call for older men to be pouring into the lives of younger men and older women to be pouring into the lives of younger women. It's not relegated simply to the domain of parenting. But one of the things that parents can do that would be very beneficial for their children is to work to help and encourage the involvement of our children in the lives of older, mature believers. There can be a supporting dynamic that takes place there. As parents, we help our children succeed in the transitions if we gradually, proactively work in their lives, greater responsibility paired with greater freedom from our parental constraints. Don't just give your children unrestrained freedom without any additional responsibilities. That does not equip them to live as mature, godly adults. And remember, because not every child is the same, this process often has to be custom tailored for each one of your children. And that's okay. That's a part of knowing your children and being proactively involved in their lives. 2 more. And if you're counting this, that means there will be 9, which is probably anathema, right? For a preacher or teacher to have a number like 9. It's got to be 3, 5, or 10, I think. Anyway, I'm going to have 9. Number 8, proactive parenting does not mean we never need to respond to the unexpected. That would be impossible to suggest that you as a parent would be able to anticipate every scenario, every situation, every issue in the life of your child, and you will have addressed it and dealt with it before it ever surfaces. No, you're not God. You are not perfect. You are not omniscient. You're not infallible. That's an impossible expectation. There will be things that you have failed in as a parent, and you have to deal with the consequences of that. Circumstances that your children will find themselves in that you never anticipated. Struggles that they will have that you are blindsided by. That will happen. Every parent, good or bad or indifferent, has to address those kind of issues. So you need to just be prepared and ready to navigate those as they come. There will be things that your children do that you never did. There will be things that your children do or that they experience that your neighbor's kids didn't do or experience, or whoever it is that's mentoring you as a parent, their kids never did. Things will catch you by surprise, and you will need to react to those unknowns. So in this case, being proactive simply just means you are aware that this is going to happen, and you're ready to face those challenges when they come. And in a similar vein, the last one, this last point, is that being a proactive parent doesn't mean you never need to make adjustments to your parenting. That you're just going to be perfect at it right from the start, that all your plans are going to be successful, that everything that you undertake as a parent is going to just be marvelous. Maybe you thought homeschooling would be best for your child, but then you realize that they don't function in that environment well, and you see the value of another method of education. Maybe you were a never spank parent, but now you see the wisdom of that form of corrective discipline. Winston Churchill said that good leaders make good second decisions. You're going to need to course correct sometimes. That's okay. Being proactive means you're ready to do that. You're willing to do that when you can see that what you're doing is not being effective. You will have to course correct 1,000,000 times throughout your life as a parent. So, you need to be a proactive parent. Face the challenges head on. Don't presume things will just work out. Don't presume that your kids are just going to figure it all out, that life is going to come easy to them, that eventually they'll get it and they'll be okay. No, that's not what the Bible is calling us to do. The Bible is calling us to be invested in the lives of our children and take an intentional approach to parenting. And we are ready and we are able to address that as it comes.